Hi, welcome to another episode of Build Implementing Business Solutions in Azure Cloud. And we're going to be talking about this a realtor company that has a requirement to actually build out a configuration solution in Azure that will allow business users to be able to upload CSV files. And the goal here is that they want to be able to retrieve a specific batch ID that represents the files they've uploaded, and they want to be able to expose that through an API so they can integrate that into their existing systems that they have. Now, obviously, the ask didn't, I don't know what the integration systems are, but one of the things that we agreed on was that we're going to provide an API for them to be able to upload the CSV file and be able to retrieve the CSV file using the batch ID that is generated. So here's a use case. So the business scenario is that the retail company, RetailFlex, operates a product customization platform where customers can configure and order personalized products. The company wants to use a configuration manager to manage products configuration data. The configuration data is going to be uploaded through a CSV file and stored in a NoSQL database. So this is the steps they're going to be able to upload the CSV file to the system, store the data in a NoSQL database, return a batch ID for tracking purposes, and that's what they're going to be used to present the data on screen. Now, this solution requires us to actually build out a couple of endpoints, right? So in this case, we're going to have two endpoints. The first endpoint is going to allow us to accept the CSV file, process it, and store the data in the NoSQL database and return a batch ID for confirmation. And then the second one is going to be a get response, which allows us to place that batch ID in a RESTful call and gets that result sent back. The technology stack we're looking at using is API management. API management, basically, we're not going to cover that, but we recommend having that set up. We'll have that in another episode. But API manager is basically the standard solution in Azure, similar to MuleSoft. If you use MuleSoft or maybe you use Data Power, that's a recommendation to use API management in Azure, and that's for production. And then we're going to be using a Azure Table NoSQL database to store our data, and we're going to be having to build out the Azure function, and the storage is going to be using Azure Blob Storage. And this is just the steps we're going to do. The instructions for the user is to validate the file they're going to be uploading, to make sure that they have the headers in place, to make sure we don't have any spaces in the headers, because when you have spaces in the headers, it becomes a challenge when you upload that. And also, you want to be able to parse the files to a JSON payload, and then the JSON payload is eventually going to be stored in a NoSQL database. Some other things we're going to be doing here: data retrieval. This is what we're going to be building out for to get the data back out from the SQL database. Sorry, the NoSQL database once that's set up. And these are some of the application settings we're going to be setting up along the way. And this is a configuration file. So for this session here, we're just going to be focusing on the setup and we have like three-part sessions. The next session, we're actually going to the actual testing the endpoints once we have all that set up. Now, if you're new to Azure, I recommend if you go to the portal.azure.com, I'm going to set up for you. You should, by default, land on a sign-in screen if you've never used Azure before, but you should have an account that's tied into your portal.azure.com. I have a corporate account, which I'm logging in, which is my Zenhay account. And then I'm logging into my own portal site here. And when you land here, you should go into your subscriptions. And inside of subscriptions, you should have an option to go into a resource group. So the way it works is that you have resource group subscriptions at the top level node, and the resource groups are secondary to that node. And then inside of here, you can have resource group, and you have resources inside of our resource group. So what we're going to be building today is that we're going to be building a new resource group, and we're going to also be pushing out a couple of raw resources out there to get that all set up, ready to go. Now, the code is available on the same location as the README. So take note of this URL. In the URL, you can take note of that. That's also in the README, and we're going to be building out this solution based on this. Now, when you decide that you land on this page, you can actually fork the code. And the way you do that is that you can use local, which actually allows you to take a copy of it and you can put it into your VS Code, which is what I'm using. Or you can use CodeSpaces, which allows you to spin up a cloud version of VS Code but that costs money. So I just want to make sure you pay attention to that. Code spaces usage for this repository is paid for by your organization. So if you decide to go with code spaces, you have to pay for that. I recommend use the local one. It gives you more control because you're downloading it to your VS Code and you do check-ins that way. Once you've downloaded that and you want to be able to want to start the process, it looks similar to, I'm just going to bring it up for you. It looks like this. So we have a couple of things in here. It's very, low, very lightweight solution. We are using C# as our language. These are boilerplate code. You don't necessarily have to make any changes to them. And we have two endpoints, one to upload a file, one to retrieve file. We have two configuration files, one to actually upload a file and the other one to retrieve files. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about quickly here is how these are connected to that. How does a C# application that has boilerplate code executes JSON, which is basically a declarative code to drive execution? So this is the project file. So the project file here has a couple of package libraries that obviously we need to actually get this working. We have the framework library, which is the Microsoft products. These ones are all about Microsoft. These are the extensions that are out of the box used in Azure Functions. But also see an extra one here, which is called ZenHay BPM Core .NET 8. This package reference is actually publicly available, so you can just type it into the package manager, you pull it down, you get the latest one, and you can use it. And what that does is connects the actual language to the configuration file. So this is basically what we call the orchestration engine or orchestration runtime that allows you to communicate with the configuration file. And then what the orchestration service does is reads the instructions, because these are basically instructions, and it executes those instructions based on the code that's inside of the um, orchestration service. All right, so what do we do now? Now we have these downloaded. We want to be able to start deploying into Azure. So the first thing we got to do is that we need to download a couple of extensions. Now, if you're new to VS Code, they go with these premises called extensions. You add as many as you need for the project you're looking for. There's a lot of them listed here. The two extensions I care about for the project we're working on is the Azure account and the Azure functions. Those are the two extensions we want to have downloaded. And once you've downloaded that, it should look something like this. You should have the A here that represents the Azure account. If you're going in for the first time, you right click on the subscription and you authenticate, then you should come back to the screen and you should be fine. And you should see this list here. Now, once you're authenticated here, we want to be able to use this function app because that's basically what we're deploying today, right? So if I right click on here, we're going to create a new function app, not necessarily deploying the code, but just creating a new function app. I'm going to click on this. We're going to go into the advanced tab. Remember, function apps have to be globally unique. So I'm going to go with training, 2024. I'm going to go with today's date, which is 11/26, right? So I'm going to go with that date. And then we're going to go with a consumption plan, which is basically what we're choosing as our default. There's other options here. There's a flex plan, which is still in preview. There's a premium, which is recommended for production environments. That allows you to manage the size of your SKUs or the amount of the size of the server you're trying to provision. And there's an app service plan, which allows you to choose predefined plans that Microsoft provides for you. In this case, we're going to use a consumption plan because it's just a demo. So we're going to go with the out of the box recommendation. And then we have the location where you live. In this case, where I live in East US 2. So that's what I've chosen. Now, the runtime stack is very important, right? So there's a couple of runtime stacks that are in motion as well as other languages are here. So if you're a Java person, PowerShell, if you're doing a Python, Node, you can pick the actual runtime stack that you care about. But in this case, I'm using .NET 8 Isolate for what we're trying to do. And then here's the important part, the operating system that you have. Now, you can choose Linux or Windows. I'm comfortable with Windows, but there might be people that prefer to use Linux. It doesn't really matter. You can choose one or the other to still work. Now, creating resource groups. Now, so this is the part we mentioned earlier. We have to create a brand new resource group for all these resources to sit in. So keeping the same name. We need a storage account to actually be provided for us, or we're going to provide one, which allows us to deploy our code out, and then we're keeping the same name. And then the last piece is that we need to make sure we have application insights. And what that is, it tracks the performance of our APIs and the behavior of APIs. So we can actually investigate anomalies instead of our APIs if we have any issues. So this actually is a very good resource to have in your solution. And with all that being said, now this is actually going out there to build it. So we go back to our site. We go back to portal.azure.com and we switch over here. And if you do a one or two refreshes, you can see that we already have the new resource group that's been provisioned inside of here. And then if you drill into that resource, you will see that we have an app service plan. And in the app service plan, we have the operating system, right? Now, because we chose a consumption plan, and this is the part I need to pay attention to, we don't have the option to scale up or scale out. So what scale up means is that we can add additional physical servers. So we have one server, we can add two servers, three servers. So we can actually, I'm sorry, what scale up means is that we can increase the CPU and the memory of each server, right? So if the server requires more CPU, we go to a beefier server. If it requires more I/O, more memory, we add more RAM to the existing server or go to a much more beefier server that has more RAM. Scale out just means adding more physical servers to satisfy your needs. So, for example, you have maybe you have a 4 core and you want to go to an 8 core, but you just want to have two 4 core machines that want to run. You can have two physical machines that are 4 core each, and then you can actually split the load amongst them, the both of them. This only is available for people who have app service plans who have premiums. They can do it auto scale. For consumption, you don't get that because Microsoft manages everything from networking to scale up and to scale out. So this is grayed out. So, so with that being said, let's go back to resources, do a couple of more refreshes. We can see now that we have application insights, we have our storage accounts, we have function apps. So if I click on the function app now, we should see that provisioned, but there should be nothing in there, right? So we haven't actually done a deployment of anything into Azure. Now, Azure gives you a couple of ways to actually do deployments, right? So if I go back into my VS Code here, while that's loading, this is what's successful, and we know that it was successful because we checked in Azure. We now have a application that we can deploy a code into, right? Now, if you want to deploy your code directly from your local machine into Azure, Microsoft does give an option. You can just do a deployment here. So you deploy a function app here, it go through the process of compiling your code, and it's going to deploy into Azure for you, right? The only disadvantage of doing this is that you don't have a pipeline in place to do continuous integration or continuous deployments, what you normally call CI/CD. In today's world, we always have to have some kind of CI/CD pattern as a complete solution. So I recommend try to use CI/CD when you can. And I'm going to walk through what that looks like, right? So in the deployment tab, if you're in Azure, the best way to get started is to go into your deployment center. Then inside of your deployment setting within Azure, you can connect to the actual repository of your choice, right? So we can have you connect to GitHub, Bitbuckets, depending on which one you're interested in connecting to. In our case, we already have GitHub, so that's what we want to connect to, right? So then because I have an account, I'm already connected to my GitHub from inside of here, it automatically recognizes my credentials. I can change accounts. And then I can select the organization I'm interested in, which is mine. I only have one organization, but then in that organization, you can select a repository. And the repository we're going for is this one right here. And then I have a default branch, which is master. You do have a user identity. So this user identity is going to be created and is going to represent the way the data is going to get deployed from the CI/CD pipeline, because the CI/CD pipeline needs an active account, or what we call an identity, to push the resources into Azure. And that's what this is. You can preview the file. You can see what it looks like. It's going to provide a client secret. It's going to provide a tenant ID and subscription. You don't get to see this because it's actually secrets. So that way you don't have to worry about exposure of credentials. And that's one of the things you have to worry about CI/CDs. Then you can actually save that. And once you save that, what it's going to do, what you save is going to go in and it's going to try to build that into the CI/CD. So we can watch this process for a second. It's saving it right now. Let's give it a couple more seconds. That's successfully saved. You can see it's saved up and deploying. So once it saves up, what is saved is what it's doing right now. It's going to kick a deployment in the GitHub repository to push code out. Now, if I click on this, open up another window, you can notice it's supposed to be directly inside of the GitHub repository here. If I open up the build and deploy, we can see that this is going out there. It's actually putting out the repository information. It's going to start deploying the code out there. And that's going to take anywhere up to a couple minutes to get that deployed, depending on how much what the agent is doing. The agent seems to be running faster than normal, but normally it takes anywhere up to 3 minutes. Right? Right. So we just give it a couple of minutes to get going. And then what we can do while this is getting deployed, because it has to deploy the code out there, we can actually go back to our resource group, go back to our documentation, and then we can continue down this path here. So we're going to be jumping around a little bit. So normally once the code is deployed, we're going to come back and do the setup. But what we can do, we can switch gears and look at the configuration file, which is going to be something in our storage account. Now, if you haven't used a storage account before, this is what it looks like. So it's called storage account. That's the type. Click on it. Storage account has a couple of options in there. It's very powerful resource, and it's a good one to have in your portfolio of resources when you're solving problems in Azure. You have a data storage option here, which has the containers, the file share, the queues, and the tables. Now, if you don't have Azure Entra ID set up on your machine, or in this case, you don't have an Entra ID set up in your environment, you want to come into the configuration section here and turn off the Microsoft Entra of authorization in the Azure portal. You want to disable that. Save this. Everything should be golden. And then what we want to do is that we want to go back to our containers, go into the instructions here, and we're going to create a folder called config, right? And then we're going to upload these files from our local machines. Now, recommendation here is that if you're in a CI/CD pipeline, add this to your CI/CD pipeline to get deployed into your storage account if you can set that up. But because this is a demo purposes, we're just going to create manually. We're going to add a container here. We're going to call it config. That's getting done now. You might see additional containers here. And the reason why you might see additional containers here is because the CI/CD pipeline, which is running right now, is still doing the deployment and pushing out the files. Once this is run, the Azure function, once that's completed, you might see some additional containers that show up here. Because remember, at the beginning, I mentioned that we need a storage account to deploy our code, but just using the same storage account to use for our NoSQL database. So we're just using it for two purposes. Once we have that in here, we want to be able to upload a couple of configuration files, right? So we go back into our code base in VS Code. These config files are basically what we're going to be uploading into our environment. So I'm going to open this up, revealing File Explorer. And then we can go in and upload these files. All right. So I'm going to come up here, hit the upload button. I'm going to browse for the files. And I'm going to select both files because that's what we want. I'm going to upload that. And while we're going to just do a couple of things in there to make sure we're good, I'm just walk you through quickly what that is. So this is the one that actually is going to be using to upload into our environment. So this is going to be upload payload. I'm going to change that name. Sorry. And then we're going to be converting that to a JSON. So basically, we're going to be taking the CSV and converting to a JSON here. And we're going to be writing it to our database, which we're going to create. So this database is going to be, we're going to keep that today's date, to keep everything simple. So 2024, 11/26. So we're actually creating this in real time. So a lot of things have to be added in. And this is the step that's on conversion. We'll talk about that later on. So this is ready to go. The second one here basically is just going to be retrieving the batch ID back. So we're going to be get some records. We're going to be creating for the batch ID. And then we're going to be retrieving the batch ID from the database, which we haven't created yet, but we're going to create a database right now. So this is 2024, 11/26. That's the name of the table we're going to be creating later on. So this is ready to go. We're going to save this. And as I mentioned before, let's come out of that. If I do a couple of refreshes here, you might see two additional files that is still probably getting deployed. Let's see what's going on over here. So this is actually logging into Azure. This is actually doing a checkout now. It's ran the deployment here. I told you it took anywhere up 3 minutes. Deployment was successful. this complete the job. This is green. We'll make sure this is green. And when you go back into here, you do a quick refresh inside of the container. You see, you might, let's see, file shares, actually put into a file share instead of a container, which is okay. So actually, we have it in here. That took a little while to come up. So we have the files are hosted. You have jobs that are hosted in here. So this is basically set up now. So we know this is good to go. So all right, so this piece is done. We had the two config files in here. There's one other thing we got to do before we swing back around to set up the environment is to set up a table. So these are table file NoSQL. So we're going to go into here. Sorry about that. Scroll down one more time. Expand here. We're going to grab this name. And then when you go into here, then when you go scroll over to our storage browser into our tables. We're going to add a new table here. We're going to call it training 2024 11 25 26. Today's 26. Yes, we're going to keep that name. And this is where we're going to be storing our NoSQL data. And obviously, it's going to be empty right now because there's no records found, but we'll come back and revisit it as we actually start using it. Now, when you create a table inside of here, you get three defaults, which is your partition key, which is used to create your data, get data very quickly, your row key, and your timestamp. We don't own this. This has to be populated, but we don't own this. Microsoft actually provides this as a way of actually giving us a quick way to get the data back. So that once that's set up right now, then we can go back now and go into function app, and then we can set up that configuration section, and we can start doing some testing. So while we're setting up our config, we're going to be going back here. We're going to be set up a couple of app settings. It's about 5 of them. So let's go back here. We know this is set up. It's green, so everything's golden here, no problem. Expand this here, and we're going to go into our configuration section here. Now, the configuration section is where you just set up what you call your key value pair, similar to what you have with your app config file. You click on the click here to go to environment variables. Very small sign here, but you click here to go to environment variables. You add here, we're going to do some adding here. So we're going to go back to app settings, go back here. We're going to select a config path. We're going to call it config. This is actually pointing to our Azure storage account. That's where it's pulling those configuration files from. We're going to have an app key name, which is very important because that's how we'll decide. That's what we're going to be using that within the API. And I'll show you later on when we get to the demo in part 2. This is going to call that XAPI key. And then we're going to have the app name and the storage account name. These are the two other ones that we need to fill out. So the app name, we're going to add in. And we're going to keep, the app name is going to be today's date. So it's going to be 11/26, right? And then we have the storage account name, which is pointing back to the Azure Web Job Storage. So in this case, we can go in here and add that. We're adding the storage account name. That's pointing back to the Azure Web Job Storage. That's that. And then we can apply that. And the defaults, the Azure Web Job Storage is part of the default, so we don't have to add that in there. So that's the only one that we're going to add, but actually 4 out of 5 need to be added, and we'll confirm and save. So now this is all set up now. We should be ready to go. If I go back to my documentation, we have the configuration set up. We actually set up these files here. I'm just doing a double check to make sure it's set up. So with that being said, join us for part 2 of implementing business solutions in the cloud. So hopefully you join me later on for part 2, and we can actually start doing some testing. Well, thank you very much.